Coast. When you have East Coast stuff happening, we're not up too late to where we don't you know, ruin our day the next day by being tired. There were a bunch of these, and we'll talk about these in 2 weeks now, because I think next week is missions conference, correct? Yeah. So in a couple weeks, we will talk about the mechanics of the process that's going on here. But just to let you know, and I'll allude back to this in a couple weeks when we talk about it, last night was the biggie of the biggies in terms of the primary and caucus season. That meaning nothing to you at this point. We'll make you aware of what's going on. But starting here with Alaska going down through Virginia, it was what was called Super Tuesday. Bunch of key election states. Some of them were pretty unsurprising. I mean, would it shock you to know that Mitt Romney won the Massachusetts primary? Yeah, I mean, he had like 70% of the vote. He was the former governor of the state. And how about this one for a shocker? Newt Gingrich won Georgia. Newt Gingrich is a transplanted Georgian and had represented the state of Georgia in the House of Representatives for years and was the Speaker of the House, so no big shocker there. The big battle last night was who was going to win Ohio. And one of the reasons Ohio is so key is not because there's a lot of delegate votes there, 66 votes, but the reason Ohio is so noteworthy is because it's one of those states in the union that people look to and say, what's the mood of the country? You know, California, people don't look to California to see what the political mood of the country is. Barack Obama or any Democrat of reasonable character could come out here and insult the people of California, tell us we're all a bunch of losers, and we would still vote 60-40 for the Democrat out here. So you don't really get a sense of, and a Republican could go down to the state of Texas and tell them all they're a bunch of losers and that they need to get a real life, and 60% of those Texans would still vote for a Republican. So those aren't states that we look to kind of give us a sense of where the country's at. On election night here in November, if you're paying attention and, oh, I should have an election party and serve all kinds of fatty snacks and all kinds of good stuff to get you to come, you could sit around and when you watch returns come in from a state like Ohio, fairly early on in the evening because it's a more of an East Coast type state, you'd get a sense of where the election's going to go. So in 2008, when Obama won Ohio fairly handily, not a landslide by any means, but 3, 4, 5 percentage points, that gave us an indication pretty early on that it wasn't going to be a good night for John McCain. And so everybody was watching Ohio last night to see how it was going to go, and it was a big battle between Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum. And for most of the night, Rick Santorum was up somewhere around 12,000, 15,000 votes. And then if you stayed up, you saw that lead dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until, like, in the last hour that they were reporting on it, Romney finally passed him and won last night. How that affects the math of farming out these 66 delegates really didn't mean much. But in terms of bragging rights and claim to momentum and this kind of thing, Romney's got that. So I was kind of thinking that maybe if this had gone more Romney's way last night or more Santorum's way, that we might be able to say we know who the Republican nominee is going to be. But for good or ill, it's not the case. The battle will continue into next week, where you see Kansas, Alabama, the U.S. Virgin Islands are going to have their thing here. And I thought, yeah, Mississippi and Missouri are going to be having theirs as well. So anyway, so the battle will continue. So as we get to it after the break, you'll get a sense of what's going on here and what a national nominating convention are. What is a primary? What's a caucus? How does this have anything to do with how we're electing a president of the United States? You'll want to know that, and we'll address that in a couple weeks. Let's see. It seems like there was one other thing I wanted to mention to you. That'll come to me. We have a little unfinished business from last time. I wanted to briefly look at, and so if you have it on you, I wanted to look at George Washington's first inaugural address. The first thing of note, if you have it here in front of you, the first one is about 2.5 pages long at the most. The second one is, well, if it's 2 paragraphs, it's, yeah, here we go. It's, here is George Washington's second inaugural address. That's an interesting thing, right? If we were to look at, and somebody is looking at Barack Obama's first inaugural address, I suspect it's a little longer than a couple paragraphs, and everyone in history except that one has been of that sort. So that one's not a particular note other than its brevity. Any observations from Washington's first inaugural address that you care to make note of before I make a few comments about it? I actually got to touch the, I don't know if they called it concrete at the time. You can go to New York City, and how many of you been to Wall Street? Yeah? Did you see Federal Hall there with Washington's statue standing on it? You can go, if you go to Wall Street for the purpose of sort of seeing the financial center of the world, you can miss a little building that's just up the street from the stock exchange, and it's called Federal Hall. It was the first seat of U.S. government. So when George Washington became the first president of the United States after the Constitution was ratified, he was right there in New York City, right there on Wall Street, before there was a stock exchange and all that stuff. And the first sort of government building was called Federal Hall, and it's still there. It's a reconstructed version of it because the old one burned to some degree. But you can go and take a tour, and in this place is the same balcony that George Washington would have stood giving his first inaugural address, this very address right here. And historians have taken I guess they called it some kind of concrete or whatever it was, the flooring that he stood on is actually right there for you. And they normally don't let you sort of get near it, but I was the first one in there that morning because I had like a noon flight out of LaGuardia. And so I wanted to go and I wanted to see this place before I left town. So I got down there and I was the first one in there, and the docent kind of found out what I was, what I do for a living and my interest. And she said, if you want to touch it, I'll let you touch it. And I loved it. So I got to touch all over the ground that George Washington walked on. You can see the Bible that he swore on when he took the oath of office, just all kinds of neat historical artifacts. Really interesting thing about that building is that at one time in the U.S. history, that one building housed all of the U.S. government. The House, the Senate, the presidency, the courts. It housed it all. Today we've got sort of a little bit more buildings and bigger buildings dealing with this. Gives you an indication that the government has grown in some degree. Anything you noticed about his first inaugural address here? One of the things I want to point out to you is the very specific religious language that is used. You'll see this, or you should have seen it this past week in his farewell address. He gave some thoughts about religion and the role that it plays in our founding government. Look here on. Here it's on page 52. The reason I want to bring this up is because we're going to be looking at Jefferson here today, and Jefferson uses a very less specific kind of religious allusion. It could be called deistic, in a sense that he refers to the benign nature or nature's God, as he does in some of the Declaration, but Washington's very specific in his language here. He says here at the top of page 52, "Such being the impressions in which I have, in obedience to the public summons, repaired to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my reverent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for the essential purposes, and may enable every instrument employed in its administration to execute with success the functions allotted to his charge." And then what follows could essentially be some kind of prayer. Here's a question for you. Does George Washington, is he violating sort of the separation of church and state by doing this? Maybe I should just ask that rhetorically, because we really haven't talked about this notion of separation of church and state yet. But we kind of live in a day and age, don't we, where we have this assumption, and to a certain extent, the religious communities in the United States have been sort of beaten over the head with this idea of separation of church and state, where we really kind of get the idea that this religious stuff is a private activity that we kind of keep to ourselves. If we want to get together and do it at places like Biola or churches, that's fine. But it really doesn't have much importance publicly. Case in point, a couple years ago, when we were having something called the midterm elections, I came into this class and I was sharing about some of the things that were going on with some political candidates around the country, and there was a woman running for the Senate in Delaware. And you may remember, if it came across your radar screen, she was accused of being a witch. I don't know if you recall this one. Yeah. Anyway, well, she was making a public policy speech to her potential constituents in Delaware, telling them her position on abortion. And she made a pro-life argument for an abortion stance, and she grounded it on biblical suppositions. I mean, fairly important policy speech. This woman came fairly close to being a senator from the state of Delaware, and she made a policy speech arguing for a pro-life view, and she referenced the scriptures as she did it. And at Biola, a gentleman in the back of the room raised his hand and said, "Doesn't that violate the separation of church and state?" What do you think about that? Do you think that that violates something of your understanding of separating church and state, to have a public official making references to God or the Bible? Yeah?
My understanding of separation of church and state is that the state doesn't influence the church and the church doesn't influence the state. Therefore, she's allowed to voice her opinion from biblical views, and that's not violating as long as the church doesn't interfere.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. You might find, and I wish we had more time in this class, I kind of look for ways to tweak us here and do things in this class. I would really like to spend, especially in an American government intro type class here, talk to you about the role that religion played at the founding of the country. And you're going to get a snippet of it here with Washington in his first inaugural address. In his farewell address, he speaks very specifically about the role that he saw religion playing in our public order. And it had a public role, not merely a private one in people's individual lives or the life of church. In fact, it seems that as you investigate the preponderance of the writings of the founders, and again, it's beyond the confines of what we can do in this class, that it seems that our founding generation saw a very public and necessary role for religion in the public order, quite different than saying religion should just sort of be walled off over there in some corner, and that the public order could go on in some way with no implication. So we live in a very different age. The separation of church and state stuff is really a vintage of the last 60 years. But we've been around as a country for a little longer than 60 years. So you have to ask the question, what's changed? And if you're interested in that question, we can talk about it as we go forward here, but if you're really interested in it, you know, we have some classes in the political science department specifically devoted to that kind of question. And I've had people from other majors take that class. So if you're just interested in this evolving role of religion in the American public life and public order, we'll address it there. Washington seems to be particularly explicit here in his religious references here. How about this one on the next page, page 53? "I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction, with an ardent love for my country, which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established that there exists in economy and course of nature the indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the great maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." that Washington says here that we can no less be persuaded that heaven will smile on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of right, which heaven itself has ordained. Do you have the sense that our country has done that? I don't want to sort of be heavy here, but do you get a sense that our country has moved away from that in some degree? Yeah? I mean, there's a whole constituency that the folks who are running for these type elections on the Republican side, now for good or ill, and I'm just sort of reporting it as I know it today, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to be a Republican in this country. It's just sort of statistically. They're very religious Democrats, I'm sure. But if you just sort of look at the preponderance of it and you're saying, I am running for public office and I'm really interested in what these religious people think and how they might vote, you're probably looking more at a Republican candidacy than a Democratic candidacy. So I can assure you that if you were to watch the returns last night, how many times did you hear the word evangelical mentioned? Because evangelicals are out in force here in Ohio last night, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia for sure. So what religious people think vis-a-vis the public order is particularly important if you're interested in getting elected. And that's really more of a question of Republicans today. Well, sure, it can be, and that's really those of us who are interested in sort of religion and the political questions have to make the assessment of whether I'm just being played to, or whether there's sincerity here. It's a really interesting thing if you get hip deep in politics like I am to sort of get better at sort of discerning that, because sometimes politicians will mouth words that have been poll-shopped in places like here to know that those words will ring in our ears and they'll just mouth them. It's another thing to see how they sort of play out. So, yeah, it's a really good thing to look at. Okay, other aspects of Washington's speech here I thought you might find interesting. He refused to take a salary, which he thought would not only save the country some money, but to make a statement that this office is not intended to get you rich, it's intended to be a service office, which is interesting given the fact that Washington is the first, and he's well aware that everything he does will be like walking in wet cement, and he's going to leave a trail, right? And Washington's precedents still to this day hold force. Many of the things that Washington decided to do, Barack Obama pays attention to. Okay, so those were the two main aspects I wanted you to see here, that Washington saw a role for religion. We'll encounter this again in his farewell address as we go forward today. The other interesting thing I thought I would draw your attention to is, in these days, they used to have this little practice of writing the president a love letter after he gave his inaugural address. The Senate would sit down and pen an official love letter, or we think you're the greatest, we're going to be fighting for you, we're with you all the way type stuff. They don't do that today. But here back in 1789, the address of the Senate to George Washington, President of the United States, sir, and then they go on and on and on, and they just wish him the best. And then here's a really interesting thing that we need to think about in light of our current day politics. Here on page 55, there's a sentence that starts, "In full persuasion of this truth." Here's what the Senate says they're going to aim for. "It shall be our invariable aim to divest ourselves or rid ourselves, to say we're going to set these things aside." What are they setting aside? "Our local interests and prejudices and attachments, and to view the great assemblage of communities and interests committed to our charge with an equal eye. We feel, sir, the force and acknowledge the justness of the observation that the foundation of our national policy should be laid in private morality. If individuals be not influenced by moral principles, it is in vain to look for public virtue." So two things there. One is sort of a regurgitation of a statement that things like morality and virtue and these things had a very religious strain, particularly at this time, not only were important privately but publicly. But also what's important here is that the Senate, these senators, stated in public and in this document, which would have been published for all to see, that it was their aim to say, look, when I debate the issues of national importance, I'm going to think about, and the forefront of my mind will be the nation as a whole and not my state. So when I debate issues in the United States Senate, my primary aim will be to think about it not as so much a senator from the state of Virginia, but as an American thinking about what would be good for the country as a whole. That wouldn't be a bad idea for him to think about today. If you know anything about politics today, it tends to get what's called very parochial, meaning that people vote on things for what they think might get them votes back in their home district, and that might be lousy for the country, but it's good for you getting reelected. These guys back in 1789 said, we're not going to do that, or at least that was their aim. So we've started lofty. The question is, have we continued along that line? And then lastly, the thing I wanted to show you was the brevity of that second inaugural address. Says something about the man where he's like, yeah, okay, let's get about the task of governing again and not have some big pomp and circumstance. Okay, well, that brings us then to our business of today. And now Washington will be fading from the scene. And that fact I don't want to be lost on you, because everybody knew that George Washington would be the first president of the United States. There was some concern about who this future president might be, but there was no concern that George Washington would abuse the powers of the office. In fact, everybody knew that he would be likely setting good precedents. So for 8 years, George Washington is president, and then shocks the nation and the world by announcing that he is now going to resign voluntarily from office and not run for re-election, which he was constitutionally eligible to do, by the way. You know, Barack Obama, if he wins in 2012, cannot run in 2016 again. When did that change, you think? A little after. Yeah, okay, with who? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, so that 8-year precedent of office stood until 1940. In 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had served 8 years already, and America was looking to ramp up into, you know, still dealing with our fiscal crisis, dealing with the Great Depression, and it looked more and more likely that we were going to enter a European war, which we now know as World War II, and ran for a third term. And that was like, wow, this is particularly shocking. So the first time in American history. So he does win a third term and actually wins a fourth term in 1944, dies shortly thereafter. In the early 1950s, when the Republicans regained control of the Congress and the presidency, the 22nd Amendment is passed, codifying into law that you can only have 8 years. But all that to say, what Washington does carries a lot of weight. And there's a lot of ambitious people who were president that probably could have been reelected prior to that out of respect for Washington as president didn't. So that's one of the important things. When he leaves the scene, he gives a very, very notable farewell address, which I want to look at some aspects of that with you, see what you saw this week. The Adams administration, it's more notable than what you'd think, but for our purposes, we'll pass by it pretty quickly because it's a continuation of Washington's policies and sort of a federalist direction of the country. The reason I want you to spend some time this week and talking about it today, looking at the Jefferson situation, is not only because Thomas Jefferson's particularly notable in our founding era, but it's the first peaceful transfer of power between two very different ways of governing. And I want you to see what those two different ways are, and that's important enough. But I want you to see that what we all take for granted in this country, the idea that if a politician loses an election, that he will peaceably, in fact, he'll put on nice clothes when his successor comes in and succeeds him. So if Barack Obama is defeated electorally in next November, I suspect that he's going to put on nice clothes. Michelle, his wife, will put on nice clothes. The new president will come to the White House on January 20th, 2013, and they'll ride in a nice car together, and they'll say nice things about each other and this whole thing. And we sort of take that for granted, that these kinds of things happen. Watch what goes on elsewhere around the world in transfers of power. It gets pretty ugly. I mean, you saw a lot of stuff go on in the Middle East this past year. Syria's having some nasty issues go on. Transfers of power can be pleasant or not so pleasant. And even though they're politically unpleasant, as you might gather from some of these elections, and the election of 1800 was particularly politically unpleasant, there was still a peaceful transfer of power. And where Jefferson took us as a country was very different. And I want to make sure we talk about that today as well. And then as we can look at key aspects of the chapters you read here, we'll look at Jefferson's presidency, and we'll see where Andrew Jackson, here at the end of our time today, took some things at a whole different level than even Jefferson took them. Okay, so you all had a chance to look at Washington's farewell address. If you had to, put a synopsis on what is that letter? I mean, or what is this address? What is this address? What is Washington doing here? If you had to sort of wrap it up in one sentence. By the way, this that you got a chance to read is one of the most famous addresses in all of American history, ranking up there with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, you know, the biggest of the biggies. Everybody, for the first 100 years of the country, every school child would have memorized this. This was gospel type stuff. This is the father of the country writing something to us. What is it? Don't just tell me it's a farewell address. You want to take a shot? Yeah. Yes. Very good. It is a series of recommendations and fatherly, as the father of the country, giving advice to the nation about what to pursue and what to avoid. And people will still refer back to Washington's farewell address today, and they'll say, George got it right, he told us to avoid this or pursue this, and we're ignoring it, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, this is a recommendation letter. So what did you see in your reading here that he recommended either to pursue or to stay away from? There's about 6 or 7 very key things here that as he gives us a letter of advice for us to see. Yes? Ooh, wow, good. Okay, and he said, hey, I think political parties are great. We should form political parties right away. Okay, so let's see if we can find that one first. Do you have that noted somewhere? Okay, it's on page, for some reason the page number is scratched out here. What page is this? It's not on page 217, so I guess it would be the next page, 218. It starts at the top of the page, the alternate domination. Is that where you were thinking? Is that where you were thinking about? No? Well, here, let me, he says here at the top of this page, if you're seeing this, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrible enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able and more fortunate than his own competitors, turns his disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. There's another section where he mentions geography. Ah, yes, down here on 216, down here at the bottom, that last paragraph going on to 217. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should be furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, north and south, does that sound familiar? Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interest and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. What's Washington arguing about political parties, particularly if they sort of form around sort of geographical interests? Yeah, Robert?
It seems like he's kind of implying, like, when you focus on the parties and whatnot, it almost turns into one party versus another, like one interest versus another, as opposed to common good things. So
yeah, and that's really key. Common. I mean, Washington is arguing, saying, look, there is a common good that we all ought to be concerned about, and that ought to remain preeminent. We ought not put geographical interest above the common interest. Was there a particular time in this country's history where that happened? Yeah. So many people look back at these very words that we just read and said, Washington was warning us that if your geographic interest, particularly in the South, got more important than the nation as a whole, then you might have what he called jealousies and heartburnings. It turned out to be an American Civil War. Lincoln will refer back to these sentiments. When you'll read here in several weeks, you'll read Lincoln's first inaugural address, and he will talk about the fraternal bonds that we're supposed to have. That's a reference to this very text. That's why this is such a huge, important thing to have read as an American citizen, because this is the father of the country essentially giving you a political sermon in this regard. So good. So that starts us. So Washington says, don't go to the way of political parties. How long do you think it is before political parties are formed in the country? Washington dies in 1798, I think. So how long do you think after 1798 we start forming political parties? About a year. Not in terms of the kinds of political parties you think about today, mass political parties where people can participate in. That's about another 30 years after Washington. But by the 1830s, we firmly have established political parties, and they're based largely, I don't even try to draw. We will look at this later in the semester. When you think about the politics of the day prior to the Civil War, you could essentially take the existing country as we had it and at that particular time and draw a line down the middle and put an R, or Republican, in the north and a D, Democrat, in the south, and that's largely the political divides that we had in the country. Precisely what Washington argued would lead to heartburnings and jealousies. Okay, so stay away from political parties. That's one of the things he has to say. What else, ma'am?
Is there a way we can turn off the air?
Are you nice and... I'm kind of enjoying it being cold. Yes, please. So powers to be back there, can we turn up the air conditioning a little bit? Washington did warn about too much air conditioning, so that's something else we'll want to look for. I kind of like it. Keeps me, you know, but I'm not sitting. I'm active. All right, so what else does Washington admonish us here to think about? Foreign alliances. That's here. Do you have a page number on that? Okay. Would you like to read this here?
To the efficiency and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict between the parts, can be an adequate substitute.
Okay. He also mentions it. Here's some foreign, so good, and here's some more foreign policy advice here on 221. He says, observe good faith and justice toward all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all, religion and morality, and join this conduct. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and no distant period, a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people's, always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages that might be lost by a steady adherence to it? Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? The experiment, at least, is recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature. Alas, it is rendered impossible by its vices. So he has a little foreign policy advice to us, and the way that it's referred to now is you might hear a politician say something like this: hey, just as Washington said not make any big entangling alliances with people, we shouldn't as well. Some people have taken that in certain periods of our country's history to mean what's called an isolationism, meaning that we should just sort of close ourselves off from the rest of the world and not be influenced as best we can by others. There was a lot of isolationism prior to both world wars, and that changed when the world had a nasty little way of coming into our world. Okay, anything else that you saw? Yes, ma'am.
He says we should avoid debt.
Oh boy, where is that? That's the, yes,
222. As a very important.
So go ahead, as a very important.
As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon the prosperity that burden which we observe ought to bear.
Yeah. Wow, interesting, huh? So the reason that he would have been speaking to us about the avoidance of public debt of such degrees that it kind of hamstrings a nation is because the country in its revolution accumulated a lot of debt that the state level, the federal government took that on, and Alexander Hamilton, who you see on $10 bills today, had a large role in putting the United States on a firm fiscal foundation, and debt was very, very low, and Washington says it ought to stay that way. We're over $16 trillion in debt now, and that's scary. I mean, it's not just a number. Washington may come out of the grave someday and quote those words to us, wouldn't he? All right, so staying out of debt is another thing. What else? These are good. You guys are catching them. Any more? How about if I give you one here? Look on page 215. He continues to admonish us, as a good Federalist would, about the necessity of a strong union. Top of page 215, the unity of government which constitutes you one people. is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence and support for your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, and your safety, your prosperity, of that very likely liberty which you so highly prize. A very liberty which you so highly prize. But it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point of your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness. My friends, he says, keep a strong union. That will be the recipe for your happiness here. That you should cherish a cordial and habitual and an immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity. Palladium is like a safeguard. So he's arguing that a strong union will literally be the safeguard to your liberties, and he goes on down the page warning that part of a departure for that could lead to civil war. Here on page, what is this page? It's this mystery page. I guess it's 218. He speaks of the importance of the necessity of a strong government toward these ends. Here about the middle of the page, in all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least necessary to fix the true character of governments as the other human institutions, that experience is the surest standard to which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country, that felicity and changes upon the credit of mere hypothesis and opinion exposes to perpetual change from the endless variety of hypothesis and opinion. Remember, especially, boy, they write in long sentences, don't they? That for the efficient management of your common interest in a country so extensive as ours, a government with at least as much vigor, think strength, as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government with powers properly distributed and adjusted its surest guardian. Boy, think about how much we had learned in 10 years. We just fought a revolution against strong government, and we establish a weak government under the Articles of Confederation. Washington and the Federalists win, and that the new Constitution is established with a strong government. He's fading from the scene here, and he says, if you want your liberties protected, you better keep a strong government. Now, I had the chance. Did any of you do speech and debate in high school? No? Oh, I had some students yesterday that did that. Well, I got a chance to be a judge in a speech debate tournament. And they have these things called Lincoln-Douglas debates. And in these Lincoln-Douglas debates, it's generally a mano-a-mano, pretty intimidating environment, where you and your opponent debate a resolution, and you either take the affirmative or negative on the issue. The resolution was roughly that personal liberty is more fundamental and more important than economic security. Personal liberty is more important and more fundamental than economic security. So in this debate, I had a young lady standing in front of me who was arguing the affirmative on that. And she was arguing that economic security takes a back seat to people's personal liberties. The negative on that argued the opposite. And I had to judge who made the better arguments and this kind of thing. What do you think in this regard? What do you think is more important? You have no thoughts on the matter? Would you like to live in a country where you had great economic security and no freedom? Would you like to live in a country where people have all kinds of personal freedom and no economic security? Yeah, you see the crux of the debate, right? So you have to, I mean, there are arguments on both sides of the issue, isn't there? I mean, if we were in fiscal chaos today, tell me about your personal liberties. Are you all awake today? Yes. So that again? Freedom of, how does that pertain? So the question is, if we lived in a situation currently where there was economic chaos, tell me about how your personal liberties might be impacted by that. A couple high school students come in here and school you guys on it apparently, huh? Well, they had some really interesting arguments. One piece that you have that they lacked, and I spent a good amount of time after their round was over trying to give them some arguments that they hadn't considered. A key piece of the argument is in this balance of a question between people's personal liberties and economic security is the question of vigor of government. Now, the Chinese have a very vigorous government. Some might argue too vigorous, because while it may provide a situation where there's economic security, it doesn't do much for your personal freedoms, does it? So it might be that the direction of government strength might have something to do with that equation. That's the piece that both of them sort of talked right past and missed. And the really interesting thing was, at the beginning of the debate, they come up and they speak very formally to you as a judge, and they ask you something. May we know something about you, sir, so that we can tailor our arguments? And I was aware that they would ask this in the orientation, and I said, do I tell them I'm a PhD in political science? Do they want to know? And they said, oh yeah, they'll really want to know that. So I said, I have a PhD in political science with emphasis in political theory, which is where they're arguing in. And the young lady in there went, cool, because she thought we're going to take this to a whole nother level. The guy, he got red. He got really red. So it was fun though. Anyway. So anyway, you guys could weigh in on that debate. Here's one of the last biggies I want you to see here. Look at and these words right here are like, wow, amazing in terms of what we may need to think about today. This is on page 220. And of all the things that are notable in Washington's farewell address, this is probably the most notable thing that people still turn back to, and that they make reference to the fact that of all the things we've done as a country that has moved away from where Washington would have wanted us to go, this might be the most notable. Here in this first full paragraph, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. The firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, the mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And then here's the famous words. And let us with caution indulge the supposition or the suggestion that morality can be maintained without religion. I might submit we've moved a bit astray from Washington's admonitions here, that we have come to see religion as a purely private activity, and that we are doing precisely what he's argued here, that there was something about religion and morality that were indispensable in the support of our American experiment in democracy. And the admonition here is that you cannot have it without those. They're indispensable. Do you think religion and its publicness today is seen as indispensable? No. No, that's what motivates me to get into the field of politics. I mean, all this hoopla about electoral stuff is interesting, but I think politics is an inherently moral venture, that you can't do amoral politics. Somebody's version of morality will win. The question is whose. It's a myth that you can't legislate morality. That's often thrown in people like my direction, because it's meant to push me over to a private corner and say, keep that religious stuff to yourself. It has no place in the public square. When in reality, when you look at the final legislation that is passed, somebody's version of morality is legislated. It's just a question of whose. So the field of politics, it draws me because I think as believers we have a lot to offer in this area, that there's something inherently public about religion and Christianity specifically, that we have something to offer here. And these words of Washington's seem to agree in this regard. I did my doctoral dissertation years ago writing on a guy who was arguing that the American experiment in democracy had largely faded from the scene because we've moved so far from this. And he had a controversial symposium that he offered with another group of scholars up in New York in the late 1990s, bringing into question whether we still owed allegiance to the constitutional order, the current regime, because we've moved so far away from these kinds of things. And largely this is a function of where the courts have taken us. And we'll look at the courts a little bit here in the latter part of the semester. But if this issue bothers you, then you'll probably at some point in your life stick your nose in some kind of legal stuff, because it's largely been through the U.S. Supreme Court and the other lower branches or lower courts of this country where religion has kind of been shoved to the private sphere under this banner of separation of church and state. And by the way, of course, the standard line, of course, that when you talk about this is when you read the Constitution, you would never read separation of church and state, will you? Does anybody have a clue where that sort of phrase comes from? It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson, who we're about to look at here, wrote to a group of dissenting Baptists in Connecticut, the Danbury Baptists, and he sort of weighed in on what he thought the First Amendment meant, and he utilized this phrase, separation of church and state. For 100 years, that phrase doesn't make it into constitutional law until 1947. 1947 is the first time the U.S. Supreme Court invokes that language of separation of church and state. So when we get to the court, I'll give you a brief sort of overview of these kinds of things so you can get a sense of that. Because that really will have an impact on your life, not only personally, but you know, as you start to have families later, you know, after you get out of college. When you have kids, it has a nasty little way of injecting you into the public square in ways that you might not think you'd ever be injected. And this will impact you. So. Okay, so I think we've touched on most of them here, but let's see if we missed any here. The need for the strong union we talked about. Don't form regional parties. We need a strong government that will keep the strong union. Stay away from parties. We just looked at that religion question. Staying away from high national debt. Advice on relations with other nations, don't form entangling, and the need for honesty. How about that one? How about that one as a foreign policy? Be honest. Awesome. So these are the big admonitions of Washington's farewell address. And this one would be, save this one, because that one would be a good one to read to your kids someday. As parents used to do with their kids. Okay, let me tell you a brief story about the election of 1800, and to prime the pump for you here, and then we'll take a break here. Washington fades from the scene in 1796, and his heir apparent, John Adams, wins a pretty close election. Thomas Jefferson finishes second. Now, you should know, before I get into this little soap opera here, that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams could not be more diametrically opposed in what they think is proper for government. They both serve on Washington's cabinet, which tells you something about Washington himself, that he would put people in his cabinet that vehemently disagreed with each other on certain things. Lincoln does this same thing as well. So when Adams wins the election in 1796, he becomes the president. By law, the guy who finishes second in the presidential election becomes the vice president of the United States. That's kind of ugly, isn't it? Think about if that was still the case today. So let's say Barack Obama wins re-election in this November and Mitt Romney finishes second. That would mean that Mitt Romney would be the vice president of the United States. Creates a interesting little dynamic, doesn't it? So basically for 4 years, Jefferson is vice president of the United States and doesn't do very much because, the president and he don't see eye to eye on some things. So then they have a re-go-around in 1800, and this time Jefferson wins a very, very close election, and it actually has to go to the House of Representatives. So let me, are we through sort of copying some of these guys down? Let me see what I have here on the, okay. So let me just reference here what's going on in this election of 1800. There's a thing called an Electoral College, and we will talk about this in a couple weeks, but does everybody have a general sense what the Electoral College is? Okay, so anyway, you might think that when you cast your ballot for president, are directly voting for president of the United States. You are not. You are indirectly voting for the president of the United States. We have this thing called the Electoral College, and on November 4th, or whatever the date will be this year, we'll have 50 different elections that'll take place in the United States, and 50 different states will therefore cast their electoral votes for the next president of the United States. The magic number you need to get to today is, that is delegates for the Republican nomination. It is 270 today, right? It's the magic 270. Back then it was something short of 270 because we didn't have 50 states. So whatever the magic number was in 1800, nobody got there. So if you get into these 3-4-way elections, today we generally have just, a Republican and a Democrat are running, and unless there's some third-party candidate out there winning some state elections in some way, you're generally not going to have this scenario come to be. But it did come to be in 1800, and here's what happened. Jefferson and Adams and Aaron Burr and some other candidates all are running for the presidency, and they all win some electoral votes, and nobody gets to the magic number to be president. And so by law, the election goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, and it could do this today, essentially we have the same situation in place today, where if nobody gets to 270 here in November, the next president of the United States would be elected within the House of Representatives. Each state would vote as a block. So we have 53 representatives from the state of California. They would get together in a room and debate for about 30 seconds, and they would cast their vote for Barack Obama. The people of Texas would get together for about 30 seconds and cast their vote for whatever Republican is up for grabs here. So each state would vote as a state within the House of Representatives. So even though there's 53 people in the room for California, California would get one vote. They did a bunch of voting like this, and nobody got a majority in 1800. until Alexander Hamilton, of all people, threw his weight behind Jefferson. And I have a quote up here that I'll show you after the break, where Hamilton knew Jefferson's thoughts on the presidency and said he'll be better than this Aaron Burr guy. But does anybody know what Aaron Burr is famous for? Dueling, is that? No? Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So the vice president of the United States was involved in a duel, and he killed Alexander Hamilton, the guy that is on your $10 bill. He was killed in a duel. And if you want to go see his funeral marker, if you go to Trinity Church there and right up there from Wall Street, you know, where they did the National Treasure stuff, Alexander Hamilton is buried there. And I think I've got, maybe later on here today, I think I've got a copy of a picture that I took when it was there. It's like this big giant white pyramid. And that's where, so Alexander Hamilton is buried, and right across the street is a CVS pharmacy. It's just sort of weird, you know, to think about one of the biggest of the biggies in the country buried across the street from the CVS pharmacy in downtown Manhattan. So weird, but anyway. So when Hamilton throws his weight behind Jefferson and not Burr, Jefferson becomes president in 1800. Very, very contentious election. Aaron Burr doesn't forget, and that ends up costing Hamilton his life later in this duel. But Jefferson takes the office of presidency, and he is going to take this country in a very, very different direction. And maybe I'll just save fire on that to look at. I want to introduce you now to Jeffersonian democracy. Modern day Democrats with a large D, the Democratic Party, which Barack Obama is now head to, point back to Jeffersonianism as the origins of sort of at least the ideas of the Democratic Party. Ironically, as you'll see here, the Jeffersonians were arguing that the Federalists were doing this all wrong, that the federal government was getting too big and too powerful, and they were wanting to draw back the size and scope of the federal government. So what's interesting about that is that's not the modern Democratic Party. The modern Democratic Party is the party of more big government and that kind of thing. And it's ironic that they draw their ideological origins or point back to this time period and say this was sort of our burgeoning and founding. Well, this is what Jefferson is about: smaller, less intrusive federal government and empowering the states more. There is little snippets of movies, of course, I've mentioned, right? The purpose of your education is to make interesting comments about movies. I'm thinking now of another movie that the men probably haven't seen. I only seen it because I'm married, and it just happened to be on in the house that night. It's called You've Got Mail. Yeah, ladies, have you seen this movie, right? Do you remember the scene where Meg Ryan and her current boyfriend were in a movie theater and they were waiting for the movie to start, and remember that scene? And somebody mentioned, and they have this fight, right? They have this fight because she didn't vote and he forgives her and blah, blah, and they walk out. They end up breaking up, but before they break up, he writes a letter that he's this columnist, and he writes a letter in his newspaper trying to defend the shop around the corner. Wasn't that the little place that her little bookstore was called Shop Around the Corner? And who was the enemy of Shop Around the Corner? Big bookstore of some sort, wasn't it? Fox Books, that's it. Fox Books, right? The sort of the Barnes and Noble type thing. So he writes this article and he speaks of the shop around the corner, and he says that the shop around the corner demonstrates a Jeffersonian purity, if you recall. And so next time you watch that movie, note that he talks about the shop around the corner possessing a Jeffersonian purity. What is he talking about there? He says that the shop around the corner is a virtuous bookstore because it's small and personal. It's not like the big impersonal bookstore, Fox Books. That's Jeffersonianism. Jeffersonianism is a different way of thinking about it, of doing governance, and saying that we need to, and it's almost anti-federalist in its tone, so if that makes sense to you, of the idea that we need to move power back to the state governments more, away from the federal government, and even elements within the federal government, we need to give special attention to the most democratic elements of it, and that's the House of Representatives. So that's what we'll make sure you're aware of now. So that's what Jeffersonianism is here. And you see an announcement of this effect in Jefferson's first inaugural address. So several notes of difference here that I wanted you to see in Jefferson's first is a lot less specific religious imagery here. Look at the top of page 323 here. He says, kindly separated by nature, not God, and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe, too high-minded to endure, blah, 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 blah. And then it's hard to stop because it's all one sentence, isn't it? Okay, so I'll just keep going. Too high-minded to endure the degradations of the others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to a thousands and thousands generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal right in the sense to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and our sense of them. Enlightened, here he says, by a benign religion. Benign religion. I'm not sure. Well, that's a lot less specific religious imagery, to be sure. Professed truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence. Notice the more generic type language as opposed to that almighty being, God, heaven, very specific that Washington would have used here. So this is where you start to see Jefferson has a different view of religion in the public order, and it plays out in our current day with people just sort of citing separation of church and state. And again, that's a whole different discussion, but you get a snippet of the fact that Jefferson took a very different view on religion and its role in the public order, to a certain extent. Okay, to his political points, Jefferson is for a smaller federal government, and he announces this vision here further down that same page here on 323. Still one more thing, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government. What does frugal mean? Cheap, small, not spendthrift. So a wise and frugal national government is the way to go, says Jefferson. Where did I leave it? Which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. If you want to have good government, you go small, says Jefferson. Smaller central federal government, and push power to the states. That sounds a lot like that anti-federalist stuff that was going on, but don't mistake Jefferson for a pure anti-federalist, and you'll see why as we go forward here. Then, where does he say, yes, he's a states' rights man here. Notice this in this next paragraph. About to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you, it is proper you should understand what I deem to be the essential principles of government. So now he's going to give us a lesson on what he thinks are the essential principles of government. I will compress them within the narrowest compass they will bear, stating the general principle but not all of its limitations. Equal and exact justice exact justice to all men, of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, well, that's a continuation from Washington, the support of state governments in all of their rights, and here it is, as the most competent administrations of our domestic concerns. What Jefferson was concerned about was that the national government was starting to involve itself in things that were purely domestic in their concerns. And what Jeffersonian democracy seeks to do is take domestic concerns and say that's the proper purview of state governments to deal with, not the national government. The national government only deals with foreign affairs. That becomes harder to separate as the country goes forward, but that's the Jeffersonian project. It is an attempt, in their view, to re-democratize American government. The Federalists were becoming too monarchical, he said. And not for bad reason, to a certain extent. I may have mentioned to you that John Adams, we were talking about Adams during the break, Adams, when they were debating about what the president's title should be, Washington's title, advocated that it should be something like His Most Royal Highness, His Highest Majesty, the President of the United States. Washington, in his wisdom, said, I think President will be fine, thank you, and didn't go that way. But there was almost a monarchical spirit to some of these Federalists that Jefferson wanted to make sure was not the case. So how did he dress? He actually greeted foreign dignitaries in the equivalent of a flannel and blue jeans. So you're an emissary from France showing up to the White House, and here's the President of the United States showing up dressed like a unkempt college student. And he was doing this not to show disrespect to these foreign dignitaries, who often took disrespect by the man the way he was dressed, but he meant to show that this office is not monarchical. So Jefferson is, and you'll see Jackson take this to the whole nother level, trying to portray himself more as a, not so much a man of the people, but not a monarch. Jackson will portray himself as a man of the people, and that's where we start political parties, and you'll see there's a connection. One thing I forgot to mention is that in this election that was very contentious, in your lifetime, was the 2000 election on your political radar screens? Do you remember that highly contentious Bush v. Gore type, sort of? Probably early for you. That's the biggest contentious election that we've had in our lifetime. If we have a razor-thin election, I mean, literally that election in 2000 was decided by 537 votes in the state of Florida. If 538 people more had voted for Al Gore in Florida, Al Gore would have been president in 2000. That's how close that election was. Well, this was a very close, contentious election in 1800, and everybody wondered what Jefferson would do when he got to the podium and addressed the country. Would he gloat? Would he announce that the oppressors had been vanquished? What was he going to do? Well, he used conciliatory language. Yeah, here. And this is some very famous verbiage that when you have a contentious election, so make note, when you see the next really, really close election, of which the last one was not, Obama won fairly comfortably last time. But if the next famous close election we have, some president is going to stand at a podium and allude back to this kind of sentiment. Bush did it, and others in history have had close elections referring to this. Let's start with here on page 322. Let us then, fellow citizens, about a third of the way down the page. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and of one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that, having banished from our land that religious intolerance, under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic and wicked and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of infuriated man, seeking through blood and slaughter. Isn't this lovely to read in your first inaugural address? Blood and slaughter and his long-lost liberty. It was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore. So he's speaking of the fact that we've just spilt a lot of political blood during this last election go-around, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But here's the famous words. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists. Those words would have been, wow, seen as very conciliatory, because that battle in 1800 was a battle between two different governing ideologies. What you're familiar with now, the Federalists, and he refers to them here, and a group of people known as the Democratic Republicans. They're not political parties yet. Political parties like, hey, are you a Democrat or Republican? I'm asking, hey, you seem to be a sort of an ordinary American. Are you in a political party? In this day and age, ordinary Americans were not part of mass political parties. This was a game played by elites. So Jefferson would have been an elite in society, and the Democratic Republicans were a group of political, legal, academic elites who had a different way of thinking about governance. And that was the battle of 1800. At the end of the day, though, Jefferson has the character about him to stand at a podium and say, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. In other words, what he's saying is, after the election, we need to remind ourselves that we're all Americans, and that there's something higher here that we're about other than electoral contests. And these are very famous words that he uses here. Okay, so that's Jeffersonianism. Any questions about that? Do you get a sense of that? You saw on your reading, and by the way, I have you reading in Milkus Nelson to give you some historical backdrop, because I realize that sort of sometimes history and behind these things is often lost on us. So as you looked at, particularly I have note on page 96 and page 101 and 102, you see these things pointed out in Jeffersonian democracy. This is in the Milkus Nelson chapter 4 reading that I had you do. There on page 96, Jefferson says he seeks to, and I think, do I even have a slide on this? Oh, let me go back to that. Here, what Jefferson is about is to say the Jeffersonian democracy is a new way of governance in which we will re-democratize the American system of government. And what that means is that things that the federal government is starting to play in the domestic sphere, he's going to reallocate and put to its proper sphere the states. But where the federal government has proper place, he sees a strong government. This is why he's not purely an anti-federalist, because Jefferson, where the federal government is proper, is going to exert a lot of governmental energy, particularly in the presidency. And Hamilton knows this. This is why Hamilton gives him his support. So we'll talk as we go forward now about Jefferson and the presidency. Very, very key for us to see here. Let me go back now to this quote. So this is a quote of Alexander Hamilton saying, this is why Jefferson, I think, would be a better president than Aaron Burr. It's not true, as it alleged, that Jefferson is for confounding all the powers in the House of Representatives. It is a fact which I have frequently mentioned that while we were in Washington's administration together, he was generally for a large construction of the executive authority and not backward upon it. Fancy language for saying this guy sees the importance for a strong, energetic executive. And that was Hamilton's #1 thing on his hit parade. So if he has to make a choice between Jefferson and Burr for president, he'll take Jefferson. And this is the sentiment that pushes it behind. Here's another key piece of Jeffersonianism. Whatever aspects of the national government are most empowered, he thinks that the House of Representatives ought to be really one of the most powerful elements of the federal government because it's most closely tied to the people. So again, why would the House of Representatives be seen as most closely tied to the people? What do you know about the House that would give you indication about that?
Representatives from each state.
They are. So are senators.
It's based on population.
It is. And there's another key element. How long do they serve? 2 years. That's a shorter leash than 6 years for the Senate. When you elect a senator in your state, they've got a 6-year leash. That's a pretty long leash, right? I mean, you can do something. What did your senator do 5 years ago? I don't know. What did your House member do a year ago? Well, I might remember that. And he's up for election again this year. So that close accountability that people in the House have makes it the most democratic, with a small d, element of the federal government, and that's an aspect that Jefferson wants to go with. Okay. I sure can. I want to make sure I didn't skip anything here. Yes, that one. Okay. We've already started to talk about the elements of the presidency. So let's take a few minutes and review that because it's been a week. I had you read a debate that took place in 1793. Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, and you got two opposing views. As good as time as any to review a little bit here, right? You've got two opposing views on whether Washington did the proper thing by issuing a proclamation of neutrality. Not that we should have gone to war or not, but the question before the country in 1793 was, who had the proper constitutional authority to issue a proclamation of neutrality? Now, let's revisit that. Talk to me and tell me, what were the issues involved there? Why was it controversial? Let's try to rehash that to kind of bring that back to our mind here, because that will make that we're going to add an element now as we speak of Jefferson and the presidency here. So what was going on? So Washington issues this proclamation of neutrality. Why is that such a controversial thing?
Because it doesn't say anywhere that it's
Perfect.
explicitly his right.
Great place to start. I sent you on a fool's, on the fool's errand to read the Constitution's first 3 articles and see which branch of government was specifically empowered to issue proclamations of neutrality. And the answer is none of them specifically. So now you're going to contend 2 very different views that says the president should do it or Congress should do it. So let's try to unpack those guys' arguments. Why did Hamilton, as pacificist, argue that it was proper for the president to do this kind of thing? Challenging you, going back a week. Holy smackers. Here in a couple weeks, this will be for real, madame.
It's not part of the judiciary or the legislature.
Ah, so first he makes an argument by exclusion and says, well, it's clearly not 2 of the 3, so it's got to be the executive branch. All right, fair enough. So that gets us started. What else does he do?
He talks about how the president's the one who's in charge of foreign affairs.
Okay.
And, like, claim
So the president is the one who's in charge of foreign affairs. That hadn't been decided yet. He's arguing that that's the case, interestingly enough. At this particular time, Madison thinks that Congress is the primary instrument to deal with foreign countries. That seems odd to our ear today, though, doesn't it? Okay, so why does he make the argument? What's part of his argument that it's the president who's, as the language of the day was, is the sole organ of intercourse between our nation and foreign nations. Kind of makes sense to us today, right? So how did he argue that? He gets very textual with this. I mean, he alludes us to certain elements of the Constitution here. So I'll pull it out. So do you remember this? This is key. You look like you're going to cite something here now. Okay, so is referring to some very specific aspects of the president's duties, but we still haven't mentioned anything about a proclamation neutrality there. So to this gentleman's point at the beginning here, the crux of the debate is, what do you do with a situation where something's not specifically mentioned? How do you decide who gets to do it? Because again, the document's written like this, and those kind of situations will come up more often than not. So these things need to be settled. So again, how does he, part of his argument is by exclusion, that he says it's clearly not a judicial function, it's clearly not a legislative function, so it's somewhere within the executive function. But he's going to have to make a further argument, isn't he, for why it is within the executive function.
Is it because of the...
You please, no, that's fair game.
Yeah. We use the general term in the Article 2 of the Constitution, so there's like implied powers.
Good.
In the general. And the example you gave about last week, how it's like when you have a baby, you don't like list out every single possibility. Good. So it's like with the initial idea of like protect the child or like watch the child, then there's like implied like responsibilities to like call the cops when they're needed and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not like specifically stated, but there's like implied powers.
Okay. This is the first time in American history where we've got to make an argument about whether an officer of our government has powers beyond the specific words of the document, called implied powers. Hamilton argues that the presidency possesses implied powers. It had something to do with that general language stuff. So what was about that? Where would we find more specific grants of power?
Article 1.
Thank you, sir. Okay, good. He draws our attention to the fact that Article 1 is written very differently. All powers herein granted, and then they're listed in Section 8 of the first article. Article 2, he says, is written very differently. It's written like, I charge my babysitter tonight. Take care of the kids. There's, says Hamilton, room for implied powers. So the presidency, unlike the legislative body, says Hamilton, has been granted a broad grant of power, which leaves room for implication or implied power, because you don't know what executives need to do. By contrast, you kind of do need, you do know what legislative bodies need to do. They need to pass laws. There's not much room for implication there, but there is with executives. And that's generally his point, and that's what we're going to add to here today. All right, so we've rehearsed that. What did Madison argue as Helvidius? Why was it improper for Washington to do what he did, and proper for the legislative body? He thinks that the Proclamation of Neutrality should have been issued by a legislative body. Why?
So you're saying that the executive branch is only supposed to carry out what the legislative
Good.
branch sets forth. And
Good.
that means it's a more narrow implied power.
Great. No room for implied powers in that. So this is the essence of Madison's argument as Helvidius. He says, look, this thing deals with something to do with treaty interpretations and treaties and the question of war and peace. That seems to be deliberative in nature, and that's a legislative deal. So this is somewhere within the legislative body. And he says the president by implication is passive, that he can't act until the legislative body tells him to go execute some law, fella. Oh, yes, sir. And he executes laws. So the presidency, according to Madison, is understood very narrowly. This narrow grant of power, he can only do what he's specifically told he can do. And that view of presidential power has been long time ago dismissed as the right understanding of the Constitution. That's why I told you when I drove in to school not too long ago, and this guy was critiquing President Obama because Obama did something that he wasn't specifically told he could do here, and therefore he shouldn't have done it. This guy needs to sit in our class and see what's going on here. He may not have liked the direction Obama took it, but he stands on unsolid ground when he's arguing that the president can only do what he's specifically told he can do. That's a Madisonian understanding of the presidency, again, long ago dismissed. And you'll see it again and again as we go forward. Now let's talk a little Jefferson and see what he adds to this mix, because Jefferson and the presidency is a pretty interesting story. Some of this is something we've already mentioned here. We've seen this slide? No. Okay. So some of these are the main bullet items of Jeffersonianism, and I'm transitioning now to his thoughts on the presidency. But he tries to decentralize. There was a centralizing tendency on behalf of these Federalists, and he wants to decentralize, push power back toward the states. He wants to return power to the most democratic of institutions, and he thinks that states, and this is starting to smell like that compact of states theory almost, but Jefferson doesn't take it particularly that far. He's not an anti-federalist in that regard. And that he wants to return power to the House of being the most democratic aspect of the federal government. So in general, what he's doing, and this is why the election of 1800 is so key, is because it's the first election in American history where you have a significant change of direction from the Federalist to a very different way of governing. And this dominates for almost the next 50 years. That's how significant this system of government becomes. In a system of government where states have primacy, the southern states start to feel their oats quite a bit. So from the years 1800 to 1850, southern states start to see their preeminency over the Union, and we all know what happened in 1860 over this issue of slavery. This is sort of part and parcel to what's going on with that. Southern states are more anti-federalist than they are Jeffersonian, but the Jeffersonians certainly give them reason to feel their oats in this regard. Jackson, as we'll see here at the end of our class today, takes this to the next level. Instead of just pushing power down to the states, he wants to push power down directly to the people. He's known as Old Hickory, the guy who's the man of the people. And there's a whole story about that, which we'll talk about. Okay, so this is the overall agenda of Jeffersonianism, and now I think we get to his aspect on the presidency, as I recall. Here's another element that I want to introduce to you in terms of the presidency. If I had any board space at all, I would redraw the following diagram. That broad understanding of executive power, or Hamiltonianism, narrow grant of power, Madisonian, or the Helvidius understanding of the presidency. Now we're going to add to that notion something called prerogative power. If you ever really want to have some interesting reading, and I really mean interesting because it has a huge bearing on the American constitutional order, you might want to poke your nose sometime into John Locke's second treatise on government. And in that treatise, he references, and this is almost word for word with John Locke, he says that monarchs or executives possess the prerogative power. What's that? It's the power to essentially do what you have to do when times call for it, for the good of the people, even if you have to go outside the law to do it. There might be times when executives might need to do things for the good of the people, and they have to go outside the bounds of their power in order to accomplish it. And the most notable example of Jefferson doing this is with the Louisiana Purchase. You all know what the Louisiana Purchase is? I grew up in the Louisiana Purchase in Missouri, right? It was a situation that was offered to Jefferson through the French ambassador, in which the following offer was made. Hey, Tom, there's this little plot of land that you guys have been interested in out west. We find ourselves a little cash-strapped, says Napoleon's ambassador here, because we're fighting all these wars, Napoleonic, all these military stuff, and we're going to offer you this sweetheart deal, but you have to tell us right now whether you want it or not. And Jefferson says, we'll take it. Now, what's the problem with the fact that the President of the United States committing the country to buy some real estate? What's the problem? He doesn't have that power. Why?
He doesn't have control of the money.
You bet, right? So when you guys get married someday, somebody's going to carry the checkbook. You want to be the one to carry the checkbook, believe me. You want that power. I don't possess that power in my family, and I regret it. I resent my wife for it. No, I don't. Stop recording this. No, somebody in our government controls the purse strings, and it was intentionally designed that the president would not have it, particularly for war. You don't want the president to have the power of the purse because he might go off making war at his pleasure, and you don't want that. Well, in this particular case, Napoleon was offering us a sweetheart of a deal. I mean, that was a big chunk of real estate for pennies on the dollar, but the problem was it would take too long for the Congress to debate the issue and pass the measure and do all this other stuff. So Jefferson commits himself and the country to buying the property anyway. It's a classic notion of this, where the president does something, and here's the key, for the common good, but he goes outside the Constitution or the bounds of law to do it. Is it constitutional for the president to do this? Clearly not. That what you had a chance to read this week was a couple quotes, and I think I've reproduced them here. Oh, here it is. I've had a chance to reproduce them on a couple slides for you here, of where Jefferson, years after the fact, admits, I had no such power to do these kinds of things, but I did it anyway for the good of the people, and I pray Congress writes that check, but I can't pretend that I can force them to do it, because there's no understanding of the presidency that incorporates that. What you're going to see is if you take the Madisonian understanding of the presidency versus the Hamiltonian understanding, they're going to handle prerogative differently. This is going to have huge pertinence when we get to Lincoln here in a little bit. And it has huge pertinence today because Barack Obama is weighing in on these kinds of things. And we have to assess at the end of the day whether what he or she did was for the common good. Because really at the end of the day, we're the ultimate judge as voters to determine whether that officer, this president, has acted well. Jefferson was cheered and we were thrilled, right? We got this great plot of land, pennies on the dollar, and doubled the size of the country in a heartbeat. And got some pretty good real estate to boot, right? I mean, I think the Midwest is a pretty good deal. What was the other big land purchase in the country? Just loading you guys with historical facts here, aren't we? What was the other big land purchase that the United States made that everybody thought initially was just an absolute disaster?
Alaska.
Yes, Alaska. It was known as Seward's Folly. Seward was the Secretary of, what was he, the Treasury, I guess, at the time? And made this deal and bought Alaska, you know, this frozen wasteland. And everybody thought it was just complete waste of money. Well, that was another sweetheart deal that we got in that thing. It's turned out to be pretty good, hasn't it? I mean, especially if you like the outdoors, if you like to go cruising, if you like oil, there's a lot of oil in Alaska, that kind of thing. Okay. So let's talk about this issue of prerogative with Jefferson and see how it comes out. The giant question on prerogative is whether you understand it in the classic Lockean sense or not. What you saw on the previous slide was the Lockean sense. That's why I mentioned it came from Locke's second treatise on government. But it means that you understand or interpret the law or the Constitution very strictly, and when you go outside it and you deviate, you allow it. But you always recognize that you're going outside the document to do it. This is the view Jefferson seemed to take. Now, before you even countenance this, let's think about this. Let's say Barack Obama stood before us today at a podium and he announced that he had done something, and he said to us, "What I have done here, ladies and gentlemen, I do not possess the power to do, but I did it anyway." Now, we don't even need to fill in the blank with whatever issue it might be. You might like it, you might not like what he did, but think about it generically. What problems would you have with your president standing on a podium and saying that?
It brings up fears of him doing it again.
Okay, so I might say, well, in this particular case, I kind of like what you did, but I don't like the fact that you're you're going outside the bounds of your constitutional powers in principle, right? It might be dangerous that our president would ignore the Constitution. We might not have if the president has to do that a lot, then we might say that the document itself doesn't really mean much, does it? I mean, if the president has to go outside when times call for it, and he has to go outside the Constitution and his powers there, man, maybe we need to think about a new Constitution. So that's one piece. The Hamiltonian understanding, and I've got a visual sort of to show you this here on the next slide, says this: no, you understand the powers of the presidency broadly, and to a certain extent, the powers of the presidency flex. And that's a dangerous word to use, because as soon as you say flexible, it could mean in your mind, and I want to make sure that it doesn't, it means that the presidency and its definition of power means nothing, or that they're just vague. The Hamiltonian understanding of the presidency says the presidency should be understood broadly, and particularly in times of crisis and necessity, it leaves room for the president to do things that he might not do in ordinary civil times, but when he acts that way during times of crisis and necessity, they're constitutional. If he acted in that very same way in an ordinary civil time, they would be unconstitutional. Let me give you a portent of things to come. What if today Barack Obama stood at a podium and he says, "I have the following announcement to make. All American citizens of Japanese descent, by this executive order, will be removed from their homes at the end of the week and will report to a desert facility which we have set up for them, and they will report to this by the end of the month. Does he have the constitutional authority to do that? Does he have the constitutional authority to issue an executive order to do such a thing? Is there any doubt in your mind? Would you fight him on this? Would if there was a protest to such a thing, would you seek to join that protest? You're much too timid. I'm on it. I'm going to protest it. So what's your problem? Anybody who has a problem with that, what's your problem? Why shouldn't we take Japanese American citizens and put them in the middle of the desert? Yeah?
Well, are you violating some kind of right?
Absolutely. They have the right to, I'm fighting all kinds of civil liberties as I would do that. Yes.
Yeah, it violates our right of free movement.
Okay.
Choice.
Yeah, sure. So these otherwise law-abiding citizens, despite their their heritage of Japanese-ness or whatever you call it, right? They've got the right to do anything within the bounds of law. Apparently not now, because now they're not free to leave this lovely resort in the desert that they're now going to have to go to. Would this be unlawful for the president to do? It depends on whether you think about it like this or like this. If you look at it like this, it is clearly unconstitutional, and Obama would never make an argument that what he did was constitutional. If he understood it this way, he might have an argument for why what seems to be unconstitutional is constitutional. What if he said at the end of this speech, now I know there's a lot of people upset about my executive order and this such, but let me tell you what's going on. The Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor yesterday, and there's a bunch of Japanese American citizens on the west coast of the United States that we think are probably helping the Japanese military formulate plans to invade the west coast. Wow. That changes the mix, perhaps changes the mix. What I'm trying to draw your attention to is that there might be something added here, namely crisis and necessity, that might change the question on this. That there might be a time where you need to do something that in ordinary civil times you wouldn't do and couldn't do. But in times of crisis and necessity, you will see Lincoln and you will see Franklin Delano Roosevelt and countless other presidents make the following argument. In ordinary civil times, I couldn't do this. Now I can, and it is constitutional. So what the Hamiltonian understanding of the presidency does is it takes things that would be outside the bounds of constitutional power and says that during certain times they're constitutional. And you'll see FDR make that argument. You'll see Lincoln make the argument. Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus at the beginning of the Civil War. That's an Article I power. That's not within the presidency's power, but he does it anyway. And he does a couple other things that are interesting. And his argument is that. So if you don't like that, then you stand counter to Abraham Lincoln, sorry to tell you, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and a bunch of other presidents that I could cite. I'm just citing the most notable. Jefferson, on this view, takes a very different tack. He says, buying Louisiana is always outside the bounds of my power, and I'm not pretending that it could be in. I'm just begging that Congress write that check. That is a Lockean understanding of prerogative. What the Hamiltonian understanding of the presidency does, this broad, is that it has the potential to constitutionalize prerogative. Okay, now that's fairly highfalutin, but it's important because your president today and my president today will make these kinds of arguments to us. You may not have recognized it, that they do such, but they are doing this kind of thing. Obama, when he instituted American military forces in Libya, made that argument. The question is, do we buy it? At the end of the day, we're the ones that kind of go, right? So, does this make perfect sense, or there's something we can talk about here to sharpen this a little bit for you? Perfectly clear? Yes.
So just like clarify.
Please.
So Jefferson still doesn't believe that it was in his
Right.
constitution, but he just.
And here's some quotes that gives you indication of this. Now, he writes this way after. So even after the ink is cleared and we've got the Louisiana Territory and all this, he said this: the executive, he's referring to himself in third person, in seizing the fugitive occurrence, isn't this wonderful verbiage? In seizing the fugitive occurrence, which so much advances the good of the country, has done an act beyond the Constitution. When I, Thomas Jefferson, bought the Louisiana Territory and committed the country to buying it, I did something that I didn't have the power to do. It's essentially what the first sentence says. The legislature must ratify and pay for it and throw themselves on their country for doing for them unauthorized what we know they would have done if they'd been in a situation to do it. I did it for the good of the country. This is a fancy way of arguing for Lockean prerogative. This was for your good. I did it because it was for the good of the country. I didn't have the power to do it. I just pray that the legislature writes the check. I pretend to have no right to bind you, the legislature. This is Lockean prerogative, just laid out right in front of you. You're going to see Abraham Lincoln make a very different argument. He's going to stand before Congress on July 4th, 1861, and argue precisely the opposite of this. He's going to say, everything I did which people think are unconstitutional were constitutional, and let me tell you why. And then he tells Congress a really long story about a long list of nasty things that have been going on since April of 1861. And that's the start of the U.S. Civil War and acts of terrorism and all kinds of crazy stuff that was going on. Not a bad argument if you're Abraham Lincoln to make. Obama today, if he were to do something like suspend the writ of habeas corpus, I'll tell you what that is as we get to it, or in my example, if Obama issued an executive order taking Japanese American citizens from their homes this week and moving them to the desert, wouldn't have reasons like that, right? Why are you doing this? This is violating their civil liberties. Why are you doing this? We're not at war with the Japanese. There's nothing going on here. Are you just doing this for fun? What are you doing this for? He wouldn't have a good argument to make. We as the American people would probably rise up and say, we're not standing for this. We're going to vote you out next time around, you know, that kind of thing. They didn't vote FDR out in 1944. FDR did that very same thing in 1942, and the American people re-elected him in 1944. So the American people are the ones that judge whether the president has acted for the good of the country or not, ultimately. Okay, so that's Jeffersonian. Does that help in terms of where he's going? Here's another statement by Jefferson giving you indication that he holds to a Lockean notion of prerogative. He says, a strict observance to the law is doubtless one of the highest duties, but not the highest. The laws of necessity, of self-preservation, are higher. So adherence to the law and constitutional bounds of power are important, but in times of crisis and necessity, you may have to go outside of it. And that's what Jefferson argues that sometimes executives have to do. Lincoln is going to make a more constitutional argument in this regard. Okay, and then I believe this might be, this is the last thing I want to look at today. So however long this takes us, and then we'll be out of here. You had a chance to read about Jackson. Let me tell you another little interesting story in another massively controversial election. When Jefferson is elected in 1800, the Democratic Republicans so control American politics, but by the time you get to, I don't have it on here, by the time you get to the 1820s, you have a situation where the sitting President of the United States runs uncontested for re-election. This is known as, and get ready to hug each other, this is known in American politics as the era of good feeling. I see it back here. These guys are embracing, and it warms my heart to see it. Picture everybody in the United States just warmly hugging each other and no political divisiveness at all. And Monroe says, I think I'd like a second term, and everybody in America says, wonderful, nobody will oppose you. And we thought that we had arrived at an age where we've done it so right that nobody disagrees, and everybody's hugging each other, and Monroe runs uncontested in 1820 for the presidency, and we have the era of good feelings until 1824, when we have one of the most nasty, contentious elections in all of American history. And what happens in 1824 is we have another one of these deals where nobody gets the magic number of electoral votes. Jackson, a hero of the War of 1812, by the way, do you know how he's a hero of the War of 1812? Oh, another little fun fact of history. You know, we had this war in 1812. I make a better window than a door, or actually I make a better door than a window, I think. We had this little war in 1812, and it's sort of a draw. The British kind of get distracted and go about their business and sign this treaty with us, ending this latest conflict with us. But after that treaty is signed, the most significant battle of the war takes place. You know, they didn't have cell phones and internet back then, of course. And so down in New Orleans, Jackson and the American forces defeat the British forces in the Battle of New Orleans. And even though it technically happens after the war is over, it makes Jackson this great military hero. And for the next decade, he, you know, is a very popular figure in American politics. Well, he runs for the presidency in 1824, and he wins the popular vote. So when you count all the people who voted in the United States in 1824, Jackson won the most of them. But he didn't win enough electoral votes to make him the president. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you right now, hang on for a couple weeks and we'll make sure that makes sense to you. So the election once again goes to the House of Representatives. And in that particular case, a backroom deal is made. At that particular time, I believe the top five vote getters go to the House of Representatives, and any one of those five could emerge from the election in the House of Representatives as the next president. A backroom deal is made between the second place finisher and the fourth place finisher. And when you combine 2 and 4, you defeat 1, and that's what happened. And that really hacks off the Jacksonians. So for the next 4 years, the Jacksonians make it their mission in life to defeat John Quincy Adams, who wins this contentious election in 1824. And Jackson takes over as president in 1828 and institutes what's called Jacksonian reforms. And you and I live under the implications of Jacksonian reforms. One of which is this, that the popular vote in a state is now tied to the Electoral College vote in all but 2 cases, Maine and Nebraska, but we'll talk about again. In other words, as your state votes in a presidential election, so your electoral votes in most cases are cast. That didn't used to be the case. And Jackson takes Jeffersonian democracy, and as I said before, takes it from the state level and pushes it down even further to the people. So Jacksonian democracy is this, where the people of the United States start to be able to participate in politics. They're more important political players. Up until this point, politics is mostly a game for political elites. Now with Jacksonianism, and they have 4 years to ramp this up, they win in 1828, they win again in 1832, and they institute Jacksonian reforms, and they empower people to play in the game of politics. And as you'll see here in 2 weeks, it's during this era where you have the institute or the start of mass political parties. The Democratic Party that you call the Democratic Party today starts during this era. Anybody who hates Jackson Party is called the Whigs, and they start up in the early 1830s too. They have national party conventions. They do a lot of the same things that we do today. It all starts in 1830. So this is a very important era. This is a very important concept for you to know in American politics. Have you ever heard the phrase, "to the victor goes the spoils"? That comes from this era. So think about it. If politics is something that I can be a part of now as an average American, unlike before that was just a game played by political elites, what happens when I work for my man Jackson to get elected? Now he can reward me. And Jackson institutes what's called the spoils system, where he puts his cronies in charge of things after he gets elected. So after you get elected, you know, you start going, all right, who got me here? And you start doling out great little government jobs. Now the problem with the spoils system is that if your guy loses, you're out of a job. Now think about why that would be a bad deal. Why would it be a bad situation where every time a president loses re-election, if the new guy comes in and puts his new guys in, why does that create, what's bad about that, you think? I mean, the good part about it is that, you know, I as president would know that in general the people working for me would be loyal and they're not undercutting me. That's the good part of it. What's the bad part of it though? Please, no, go ahead.
Like no experience.
Yes, just starting over. Think about jobs that you start, you know? Yeah, I mean, it takes a little while for you to ramp up and get good at your job. Well, just about the time you're getting good at your job, your guy loses and you're out of business and some new guy has to come in and now he has to go through that same process. So what they started to see was this constant turnover didn't lend itself to great efficiencies in government. So starting around the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, they have what's called civil service reform. And certain government jobs are now protected against the political process. So maybe some of your parents or some people you know may be civil servants of some sort, and they are insulated. So if Obama loses, they're not sitting there watching their television on that November night going, oh, I'm out of a job. I mean, some people are going to be out of a job. I mean, some people at certain levels of the federal government, if Obama loses, will be out of a job. If Hillary Clinton is watching next November and she sees that her boss, Obama, loses, it's likely she's out of a job pretty soon and she better get a resume out there, right? Maybe for President of the United States, ladies, I mean, there will be one person on the Democratic side celebrating if Obama loses in 2012, and it will be Hillary, because if he wins, she may never get to run for presidency, but we'll see. So civil service reform is an effort to get away from the spoils system. So again, what is Jacksonian democracy? It's taking Jeffersonianism to the next level. Jefferson wants to empower states and re-democratize America in that kind of way. Jackson wants to take it to the next level and push power down to the common people. And there were literally animals housed in the White House during Jackson's age. You could have walked into the White House and there would have been animal pens on various and sundry floors of the White House. That's how sort of common things were. During the Jacksonian era, the doors to the White House were generally unlocked, and if you knocked on the door, it's quite likely that the president himself would have answered the door. What are you selling, Girl Scout cookies? I mean, literally, you could do this. Up to even Lincoln's day in the White House, if you wanted an audience with the president, the bottom floor of the White House was open to average people, and they could come in and sleep on the floor hoping to catch the president as he walked by in the morning. That's a result of Jacksonianism and empowering the people sort of the deal. And that's the roots of the Democratic Party, is in the Jacksonian era. So the true founding of the Democratic Party, as you'll see in 2 weeks, happens during that era. And that's what Democrats more point to in terms of their origins, sort of we're the party of the people, this kind of thing, and they're pointing back to that era.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.